Welcome to our form drawing webinar, and my name is Melissa Nielsen, for those of you who don't already know me, and we're just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and erase the board. If you are drawing with us today, you're going to want to have some drawing paper, and you can use computer paper. I usually use a heavier bond drawing paper like what you would find in a main lesson book, or even form drawing paper, or even an artist sketchbook. I like to have something a little bit heavier than computer paper. But if computer paper is all you've got to practice on, that's totally fine as well. When I'm working on forms with older kids, oftentimes I'll have them practice it on a chalkboard before they put it in their lesson book, so that they have only their best work together in the lesson book and that sort of thing. But we're going to talk about form drawing from the very beginnings of it. Form drawing is one of those things that if you're new to Waldorf, you're probably thinking, what in the heck is this? How do I implement it? And why is it important? Why is it necessary? And I think what happens, what I found in our practice working with families, is that it's kind of one of those things that if you don't understand it fully and you feel like you're not doing it right, then a lot of parents just stop and they kind of let that part go. But form drawing is this wonderfully spiritual and intellectual activity all at the same time. It really helps balance temperaments. It helps teaching children to write. It helps them with form. It helps them with fine motor skills. And from the very beginning, when you start forms in grade 1, it really helps them understand the line, the curve, and the line. And everything, every shape pretty much that you'll make from there on out has some sort of curve or line to it. So even though we'll be starting with those forms, that's kind of the very beginning. Some things to remember is, or some things to remember about form drawing is there's definitely a progression that goes through the grades, and that you really want to practice it yourself. Like anything else in Waldorf, it has to live in you, the teacher, before you can really fully bring it to the child. So if you're not convinced of its necessity and you don't see it working on you and helping you, then you're going to have a hard time bringing it to them and convincing them. So, it's just like anything else. You can't tell your kids, oh, we have to knit now, if you're not into knitting, or, oh, we're going to do this activity, oh, let's paint. Or whatever the activity may be, it really has to live inside you. So I encourage you, even if you're brand new at it and your kids are older and you're, in a rush to really want to bring this to them, step back and take the proper time to do the inner work and to practice the forms, work with the forms, and really let them be part of you before you bring them to your children. For those of you who are watching with kids, I wouldn't have little kids drawing with you today, but if you've got some older kids that haven't done form drawing before, then they're welcome to kind of step in and draw with you if you'd like, and just kind of go from there. Again, if you have questions, ask them in the chat box, and Eric will kind of give me a hands up that he's got a question, and then we'll just kind of go from there. So please let this be as interactive as it can be. Again, form drawing really came about as a pre-writing sort of thing. But deeper than that, it really helps you bring things together on an intellectual base, but not in a thinking sort of way. So it's kind of a non-thinking intellectual activity at the same time. When we work on it through the grades, we start with, do you have a question already?
Oh yeah, what age do you start teaching form drawing? Kindergarten first or even younger?
I wouldn't start younger. If you've got younger children at home, kindergarten, preschool, if they want to come to the table and draw with you, I think that's perfectly fine. Other consultants might tell you no, that's not the way to do it. I think when you are at home teaching, like anything with Waldorf, you really have to work with where your family is. You kind of, in most cases, you kind of can't segregate your child off and go, here, we're going to go in this room and you kind of entertain yourself over there. It doesn't really work. So really and truly, form drawing, as far as instruction goes, starts in about first grade. So, and the reason why it's starting in first grade is that's when, on the timeline here, as far as where they are developmentally, they should be starting to write and learning to write. So especially if you've got a younger first grader, I would say do an entire block of form drawing. Now, if you've got an older first grader, and this is my opinion from, having children that fall in all different places on the spectrum myself, as far as having a young first grader and a first grader that's, kind of in the middle year-wise, and then an older first grader, I would really, if they're older and they're already knowing their letters, then I think you can probably not do an entire block of it just by itself. You can kind of work it in with your other things. And that's kind of what we've done in our grade 1 book. But if you've got a really young first grader, one that maybe has just turned 6, you're kind of not sure if they're even ready for first grade yet, do some form drawing activities in an entire block and make up stories that go along with them. And I'll try to give you some ideas as we go along, the different ideas that you can do to go along with the forms as to kind of make up stories. So again, you're starting this as kind of first grade activity. One of the things that you're concentrating on, because form drawing, especially in the early years, really works on the will of the child. So you're not focusing on making a picture necessarily out of the form. Now, if you're telling a story about a flower and the form ends up being like a flower, that's fine. But you really won't be transforming that form into a flower then. Starting to really kind of discourage that for those early years, because they're really focusing on the form itself. And if they're thinking too much about what they're going to do with it, they're not then really focusing on the line and the curve. And that's really where you need their focus to be in the very beginning. It's kind of on that line and that curve. So again, it's kind of starts as an activity that's part of the will, and as they grow, it really begins to work on their thinking and their feeling parts too. And we'll kind of go through a progression a little bit of what you can do through the grades. Now, as far as frequency, I know this comes up quite a bit. Again, in the first grade, I would do it as often as you can, because they're starting to really learn to write, and a lot of parents are freaking out. Oh my gosh, their penmanship is so awful, and they write this big, and how do I get them to kind of get control over that? Form drawing is a way to really get them to pay attention to their lines and their curves. And so, they will absolutely start to gear their handwriting to the appropriate kind of place. My rule has always been, because we've done several writing programs throughout the years, and what I've always come back to is, if I can read it and it's comfortable in their hand and they're making their forms beautifully and taking their time to do it, then I'm all right with how they write. So it's really about being able to read the handwriting and having it not be like this super painful and arduous experience for them. It needs to be able to flow from them. Any other questions, or are we doing good so far?
We're good.
Okay. So really, when you start to introduce form drawing in the beginning with a young child, you're starting with very basics, straight line and curve. And those basics will then turn into the letters as you're introducing them throughout the first grade. So we're going to start with, and I'm going to do my best to use chalk that that really is light enough for you to see. So if for some reason you can't see it super well, please let me know. So you start with kind of the straight line, and in our first grade book we kind of have stories. It kind of goes along with the story. But again, if you've got a really young first grader and you're wanting to do a block on form drawing, I think that's totally appropriate. And then you can pick them even back up when you pick up the grade 1 stories. But you're really talking about standing straight and tall. The straight line stands straight and tall. And the curved line And I would do it both ways. You can also draw pictures, like for instance, if you're drawing maybe the rump of a cat for your picture, and you're asking your child, where do you see that curve? Where do you see that curve? Oh, I'm going to draw an ugly cat, but where do you see that curve in the cat? Do you see that curved line? And allowing them to kind of draw their attention to see it, but you're really wanting them to focus on being able to do the curve. Now, as far as practicing goes, I wouldn't go straight to the paper or the chalkboard, especially with a really young child. I would start in the air first and drawing it in the air. One of the things that I know they do in the schools, and my kids love to do it because they get all giggly about it, is drawing it on each other's back. So you have, you would draw it on your child's back and then let them turn around and then draw it on your back. And that kind of brings it into a more feeling place. Other things that we've done, we've taken sidewalk chalk out to the sidewalk and I've drawn it, and then they've sort of walked the curve or walked the straight line. So that's a good way to do it. Play-Doh is another way that you can do it. Get your Play-Doh out and you use the Play-Doh to shape some of these, because you really, again, want it to become part of them. You want it to become natural for them to make these sorts of curves and straight lines, so that it's part of their being and it's part of who they are. And yeah, that seems really boring, but if you're bringing story into it and you're bringing thought into it and your reverence into it, form drawing, it should be a very reverent sort of activity. I kind of really think about it the way I think about handwork a lot of times, where handwork is a more reverent type of activity. Form drawing for me is a lot of the same. And so, really bringing that reverence to it. And so I kind of keep them from getting off track. And, a lot of times when we're doing forms, because of the ages of my older children, it's right along with their lesson block. And so we'll talk about that in a bit. But when you're doing it with younger children, you really kind of need to find a quiet space. So even if you've got little ones that are climbing all over you, still find a space and say, if you want to draw, you can draw. Here's your space to draw. But, I'm going to draw over here with Susie, and this is the drawing that we're doing. And so, like I said, if your little ones are coming along, I think it's okay, because you're not instructing them. They're sort of along for the ride. So that's really where I see the difference. And it's just not possible at home to have everything in the same sort of almost sterile setting that you would have it in a school situation. So, just kind of pick your opportunities and again, make it a more reverent sort of activity. So this would be like one of the very first grade 1 forms that you would do. And again, you can talk about the rump on the cat. You can talk about the curved back on the little old lady that has to curve her back over, and she's curved, but her cane that she uses to walk is nice and straight. So there's, kind of an image for you to work with. Another one is the wavy line. Now I like to talk about the wavy path. We live sort of on we live near a river, near the Snake River, and the green belt that goes around the river is kind of this wavy line. So if you can bring it into being with something that you've already, got and that you can experience there at home, that's a wonderful thing. That it's a little bit like walking the green belt or riding your bike on the green belt and kind of making the shapes and doing the movement. They really need to kind of get into it and really feel it. So this would be another good first grade drawing. For there, and you'll catch, it's okay if they don't do it perfectly, but what you'll find is that if you take the time and they take the time to be reverent about the activity, then it's going to be a lot better than if they were really hurried about it. Now, if you've got a first grader that's doing this, or even more so like this, then you've got to help them loosen up their hand. And again, I kind of forgot to say this, but I like to use these nice fat Stockmar crayons. They're perfect for this. This is not a colored pencil activity. This is definitely a crayon activity, and it is not a block crayon activity. Block crayons are for drawing. They are not for writing. So really, this is an activity that you would use a crayon with. And I usually put out a couple of different colors and let them experience color with their form drawing. That will keep them from kind of trying to decorate it too much and make it into something too much. So, really by using a lot of color, you'll be able to kind of help them feed that need. So once you kind of work on these, and if you've got a child that's real rigid, you're working on helping them to relax. So you just practice it, and if they're super rigid, that's where I would then kind of take more time with, say, the Play-Doh. Or another really good one is put some flour out in a pan and let them run their finger through the flour, or rice, or anything like that, so that they can make the movement with their finger, getting them to slowly make the movement in the air. So this really is helpful for really rigid children. I did find when my oldest that has ASD, when he was doing these first forms, because he is so rigid and he needs rules and he needs things to be in a certain way, then he was much more right here. And we still today, and he's 12, have to work on, reminding him that he can breathe and relax. So doing the breathing and the relaxing with him. Breathing in is constricting, breathing out is letting go. And just kind of doing that and keeping it in a really light, almost meditative place. Almost a little bit like yoga, for those of you who practice yoga. So just kind of keeping that breath going in and out. Because children that are really wanting to tackle it will come after it in this place up here. And they'll probably hold their breath the whole time. And so you really just have to kind of get them to ease their way into it. Because there is a place for this, and this is definitely a first grade form, but they need to do this flowing thing. Now when you've got children that are super young, they're only going to want to do this flowing thing. You're going to see lots of their more rigid forms are going to be a lot more flowing. And that really is a way to tell you whether or not they're ready for a lot of first grade activity. Because it's not really, because this is an exercise in the will, if they're not ready to take command of that, then, you might consider letting them play a little bit longer and going after first grade a little bit later. So, one thing that I always tell people that I do when it comes to form drawing is it's like super relaxing to me. So, and I haven't done it in a while because I use a lot of different meditation techniques. But if I'm having a really constrictive feeling sort of day and I need to figure out how to loosen up, this is a great way to do it. Take a notebook, sit down in the kitchen with your crayons and just breathe and work on these forms. And it helps lighten you. And before you know it, the whole table will be filled with children who want to draw with you. So, really kind of getting them drawing with you is a good thing. You can also use some of the stories that go with grade 1, the Grimm's Fairy Tales. You can easily work some of these forms into a lot of those stories. In fact, when we were writing grade 1, we tried to work it either into the container story or so that you could somehow have it in the Grimm story or in the fairy tale at the same time. So, and this next one would be a good fairy tale type form. Because it looks like, of course, like a castle. And again, letting them do it in a couple of different colors will probably help them. And you could do it all the way across the page and practice it. And it really helps that rigidity, especially if you've got ones that are super dreamy. That really helps them kind of come down to earth a little bit. I was doing some reading on some of Steiner's lectures about this, and it talks about children who aren't ready. You will see a lot of kind of open-ended forms because they aren't ready to kind of close things up yet or make that rigid change. So other ones, these again are still first grade forms, and you can see the letters being born out of many of these. And you can talk about mountain peaks being really high, and things like that, like the Mount Semele Grimm's fairy tale. This would be a good one for that, the high mountain peaks. You're introducing and the M sound anyway, so there's the mountain peaks for you. How are we doing on questions? Any questions?
Oh, no more.
We're good?
questions.
Okay. This is another good one, which kind of follows that one. And your really rigid kids will love it, and your really spacey kids will not. And this is just across the page. Again, use different colors, getting them really into just experiencing the line and not thinking a ton about, you know, the picture that they can make, but really being able to control the line. Now, I've been told and I've read, and I've actually seen it happen, it does work on them in their sleep. So I would work on one form a week, and then just kind of let it go to sleep for a while, and then maybe pick it back up later on in the year. And you'll see great transformation, and a lot of that comes from them being more developmentally ready, them having been writing already, because when we talk about the straight line and the curve, that we've got the letter B, and that's easily the straight line and the curve. Once you're introducing letters, you absolutely can make a picture out of it. So of course, you can make a bumblebee out of this, and here's its wings, and or a butterfly even, and kind of go from there. But when you're just practicing the form, then keep it to just the form. So that's some grade 1 forms. Let me give you a couple of others here. And I've always kept a form drawing notebook of my own, and it just kind of makes your life easier, so that, especially if you have more than one, so that as you're going along teaching, you're not reinventing the wheel constantly. You have it all together. Here's another one, and a lot of people will say, oh, a first grader can't do this. And maybe an early first grader can't, but towards the end of first grade, you'll see first graders being able to do this. And you can see a lot of cursive writing in this as well. And so when you're doing form drawing regularly, then it's easier for them to move into cursive writing, because they're already doing all of the movements and all of the things that go along with that. So it really makes handwriting much easier. Again, we used different things through the years for handwriting, but I always felt like what we were doing with form drawing gave them far more perspective on how to actually write than any handwriting program. And plus, this is far more fun to copy than a bunch of M's and S's, and it really kind of gets them into that groove. So that's this one. Again, use color. That will keep them interested. Let's see here. Another one, and this could be later if you feel like you need to, but this is good for those lowercase m's. And what you're looking for, moms, when you're doing yours especially, and then as your child gets older and does more form drawing, that you can be more uniform. Now, I've heard some teachers go back through with kids and they'll take another crayon and correct it for them, but I've heard other teachers say don't do that. I think you really have to follow your child. If you've got a child that's a super perfectionist and they're going to freak out if you do something like that, then don't. But if you have a child that's really having problems with getting the grip right, then maybe one thing, instead of correcting their work on a chalkboard or on a piece of scratch paper, I might put my hand over their hand and help them to feel the movement. Oh, you can't see me? Sorry. Over their hand and help them to feel the movement. So, and again, the same with the bottom, trying to keep that. It's really a lesson in how balanced you are as an adult too. I tell this funny story sometime when we were writing the grade 4 book, and Eric came to me because we were kind of in a crunch, and he said, "What can I do to help?" And I said, I handed him a bunch of forms for grade 4. I said, "Here, go draw these so that we can get them scanned." And what did you say to me, honey?
It was really
He came
hard.
back to me, he was like, "These are really hard." And so I handed him my notebook, and I said, "Here, start with the first grade ones and work your way up." Because it is really hard, I think, if you're just jumping right into it. I've taught classes here for an initiative that's starting up. And form drawing really, it can take hours and hours and hours. And so to get done with, a couple hours of a session in teaching the hows and whys and only be on the second grade forms is not, it's not out of the ordinary. So here's another one. Just watch my hand before you draw. Again, this would be later in first grade. And maybe even second grade if you've got a first grader that's not ready for it. But really, it's H. So if they're already doing this movement, they should be able to get this back and forth. And drawing it in the air, back and forth and back and forth. A great thing with a lot of these, when we do form drawing, I tend to do it first before we do a lot of other lesson work, because it kind of gets that crossing in the midline thing going. And, Steiner felt like if you could do it both ways, now I'll probably murder it the other way. With your other hand, up, not as bad as I thought. I'm a lefty though, so we're kind of weird anyways. A lot of us are ambidextrous because of being forced to be that way. But if you can do it with both hands and kind of mirror it back and forth, that's a good thing. But it's kind of a brain bender for a lot of young kids. So don't be stressed out if their forms aren't perfect. And don't be stressed out if your forms aren't perfect either. You have to remember, I've been doing form drawing for a long time. And they're still not perfect. Sometimes I get really frustrated and want to run away and put it up for a while. It should not be a frustration. It should be a very meditative activity. So if you're getting mad at the chalk or at the crayon, walk away. Take some time, breathe. So we're still doing first grade forms here. This is a good one for perspective. And this again would be more later first grade. But here they're still in this place where they're drawing everything so big. And you're really trying to start getting them to gear down their work so that it's smaller. And it's hard for them because they're still learning a lot of perspective and learning how something fits and learning to gauge how something fits on a piece of paper. So this one's kind of helpful in that respect, where you start smaller and you get a little bit bigger and bigger, and then you work to get smaller again. That's a good one for that kind of activity. I think a lot of this is really therapeutic for the child. Working on circles. I can remember as a child being really frustrated because my circles were never completely round. And even there you can see it's not totally completely round. It's okay to go back and correct it yourself afterwards. In fact, that's a great thing about using crayons rather than pencils, is that you can go back over it with a crayon and hide mistakes in forms. But doing different circles within circles, that's a great one too. It's the angle that I'm standing at. I usually do it with paper on the table. So at least that's the story I'm going to give today. And then going even bigger, you can take this and just kind of play with it a little bit. And here you've kind of got a figure 8 going. And what's fun is, I really think that as you're working, and what I've noticed, is that my children will be drawing them and doodling them kind of, on their own when you're not looking, when you're not watching. Could do ellipses too. Do more oblong circles. And really just taking the time to pay attention to the activity, the feeling of the crayon in your hand and the movement of the crayon, the willing activity of putting it all together. You know, and then they can create their own forms that come from, you know, from within, and just kind of playing with them. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. Up and down. And you know, you'll find pictures of forms all through nature, in architecture. So if you find something you really like, really think about where your child is and what that form brings out. And if you're practicing it yourself, then you'll kind of know, because it lives within you, you'll know whether or not it's appropriate to bring to your child at different ages. So, you know, that would definitely be appropriate. We're going to do a spiral next. Let's make this prettier. Let's use something brighter. I don't know if you can see this at all. And on spirals, you want to do both ways. You want to start at the center and go out. And then you also, and they look very different, I think, when you look at them. I can usually tell which ones of mine are from the center and out versus which ones come from the outside in. And I can tell in mine because of how I spaced my lines. And so if you're working, doing a lot of inner work, and you're working on yourself from the inside out, your lines will tend to be, just in my experience now, your lines will tend to be a lot more evenly spaced. Where if you're coming at it from trying to work on yourself from the outside in, my lines generally are not, my chalk, not quite as, I did a different one. Do we have a question?
Oh, just a comment. Tammy Lee says that they love to use a spiral form drawing as a sun and then add the sunrise.
Add the sunrise, absolutely. And you'll see them doing that in your picture. And so maybe if you're telling a story about, see, I'm being really super overcautious now because I want to make sure I look balanced in front of everybody. And I tend to make more circles when I'm going from the outside in. But, you know, if you're telling a story, you could absolutely then pretend this was yellow and turn this into, you know, the spiral is such an important form. Because life really just repeats itself in a different spiral as we go on. So it's a very good form. And this is a fun one to walk. So if you've got a place in your yard where you can make a labyrinth of sorts, a spiral labyrinth, that would be a good, when you walk the spiral at the winter solstice, and I like to do one at the summer solstice as well. For me, in the winter, walking from the outside in, and again, this is just me and my own inner work, walking from the outside in the wintertime is a very therapeutic sort of thing because you're coming in and you're tending to spend more time inside. Where when I tend to do it in the spring or summer, I'm ready to kind of let things go. It's that out breath. It's that being ready to experience the world outside again because we've maybe been locked up too long, especially living here in Idaho, right, dear? We're waking up to negative temperatures quite frequently. So again, that's more first grade. Let's do this one. I'm going to try this other color of chalk, so let me know if it's not bright enough. Now this you'll recognize as the cursive letter L. But again, it's just curves. And if you're doing it in a picture, you could do it as a holiday picture, and it could be your tree, and it gets fatter as you get to the bottom.
Is it okay to use pencils for form drawing instead of crayons?
Not until they're older. That's really something that starts probably, because especially with first grade, they're using crayons, or they should be using crayons for most of their writing anyway. Until I don't like to use colored pencils until the very end of first grade. And you know, if you've kind of done the Waldorf thing the whole time, it's not going to be a struggle for you. But if your child is coming from a different background, it may be a struggle. So don't make school a struggle. It definitely shouldn't be a struggle. So if it is, kind of let go a little bit. But, you know, really, as far as doing most of the forms that we're going to be working on today, they should definitely be done in crayon. You can go over with crayon and correct things a lot more beautifully than you can with a colored pencil. And if you are going to use pencils, you know, even for writing in the lower grades, and even in the upper grades, we have the kids do this, make it colorful, make it beautiful, you know. It shouldn't just be an ugly lead pencil. It should be a beautiful pencil. And they, you know, I've taught my children, I have a couple of real perfectionists, that if they mess up in their work, it's always easy to turn, you know, say they were trying to make an L and that wasn't really what they wanted. I always encourage them to, in their writing in their lesson book, make it pretty. Turn it into a flower then. Make it something that adds to what you're writing about instead of freaking out and having to tear the whole page out and start again. So, but I definitely, you'll need colored pencils for the upper grades because their forms are a lot more precise. Once you get past some of the lower grades, you're working on, like with grade 5, you might be doing some hieroglyphics or some Hindu type writing or even mandalas. Those you're going to want to use a colored pencil for because you can get a lot more precise with a lot of those things. In grade 6, if you take up writing Islamic, then you can really use a pencil in that respect, or even a pencil that you need to erase on if you feel like you need to. But really for the younger grades, the nice fat stick crayons are the best. And again, no block crayons. No block crayons. Block crayons are for drawing. Here's another one. Again, we're on grade 1. And a lot of you might be thinking, there's no way my first grader can do that because I can't do it. They can do things that we can't do. My children are proof of that. I always sell them short, I think, a little bit when I draw stuff and they just come right up and can do it. But again, you're making the movement, you're taking the time to work with them and doing those movements. And this would be still first grade, this next one, but working a little bit more with going on, because really what you want to do by the time they're 9, and I'll cover this more as we get through some of the second grade forms, but by the time they're 9, you want them to be able to see symmetry and do both halves. So, you know, you're kind of working in this progression. And so here's another one. Again, working on perspective and really getting their heights right. And you know, I want to caution people too, and I probably should have said this in the beginning, don't talk about it as much as I'm talking about it. Just do it. Do the form, draw it in the air. Don't give them more information than they need. Don't, like I said, talk about it too much. Don't intellectualize it. We do that as adults, and really if you just go in and you do the drawing, and you teach them to draw it in the air and come up with other ways of putting things together, then they will absolutely pick up on it without needing to hear us. I think we talk like way too much sometimes. And this would be another way of doing this form. And we'll try to put some of these, because I have slides already made, We'll put some of them up on our blog too. Yikes, that bottom line. See? I'm not used to drawing down that low. It's probably kind of ugly. Just kind of zooming through these a little bit. Okay, here's another one. Older child. You could have them absolutely mirror it. Now, I was doing some reading this morning, and I don't know how I didn't come across this before, because I have rowdy children, and I'm totally going to be using this now, is Steiner said in the classroom, if you've got a child, so at home, that's wanting to interrupt a lot and super rowdy, maybe an older child that's older than 9, do some kind of crazy form, and I'm gonna erase this and stand on the other side. This is to tame the wild child. Do some kind of crazy formula, do a line, and then do something nuts. Just kind of. And then their work is to recreate that on the other side. So that's going to get their mouth closed while you're being able to work them with another child, or if you're needing them to just bring themselves to center and calm down a little bit. You know, because it's going to take them, let's see if I can do it. It's going to take them some time, oh man, to then be able to, because their mouth can't be moving too much. You can see what trouble I'm having moving my mouth up, and that's backwards. See, that should be on the outside. See, I totally flubbed it up already. I was just doing the same form, only... So really getting them to close their mouth. Obviously I can't talk and do hard forms at the same time. That's a great way to help with the disruptive child. We have a house full of those sometimes, don't we, dear?
Yep.
It's definitely loud, but fun. And by the end of first grade, because they've been doing all of this, you could try to work with a star. Some will be able to do it, some won't. And then, of course, by second grade, you're going to be doing more on that star shape a little bit. So let me find... I was in third grade. Okay, now we're going to kind of move into some second grade forms. And this is where we're starting to move them towards more mirroring forms. And being able to use kind of both sides. I'm going to use this yellow and see if I got this. Let's see. Okay, on this side, can you see it all? Or is my big bum in the way?
Oh, no, we could see.
Okay. Alright, so you've got your center line. This one always reminds me of a squid when I get done. I'm not quite sure why, but... So you're working with both sides. And, you know, you'll have children that will be more dominant on one side being able to do it than the other. And again, the trick is being able then to take your crayon and do it with the other hand as well. So let's see if I can recreate part of it with my other hand. It just takes practice. Okay, see, it's not totally perfect. Comes with time. Actually, now that I'm looking at this form this way, if you were telling a story, perhaps about a ram, this would make a very good horn for your story. This one kind of goes in another direction. So we've got our baseline here more. That's not as straight as I'd like it. And there will come a time in second and third and then on up where it's not going to be practical to draw it in the air on somebody's back. And it's also kind of loses its necessity. Once they get the curve and the line and they get their hands moving in that more of a relaxed kind of fashion, then, you know, it's not needed nearly as much. Unless you're working with an older child, and I've done this before too, who's having trouble again getting back to that curve, then I go back and have them, you know, do waves with both hands and just kind of really getting them loosened up a little bit. You could dance in front of your 9 or 12-year-olds. They'll think you're pretty lame. They think we're kind of crazy anyway. And for those of you who are watching this after the fact on the DVD, it's too bad you couldn't join us live. Okay, now we're going to work on some more progressive type forms and how they could come together over time. Still more of running forms, but these are a little more progressive. So you might start with a loop and 2 more loops. I need to get bigger chalk here. And then we're going to get these 2 loops closer together. And then we're going to cross them. Let's see if I can do it without messing it all up. Kind of bringing it back on itself. And these are cute little mouse ears. If you're telling a story about a mouse, its tail. Again, they're focusing on the form and having their hand move with the form. Okay, hopefully I haven't lost anybody. They're getting harder. Make a mental note of where that one was. Okay, here we go again. So, kind of doing that pretzel form. It's harder to do it on the chalkboard, I think, than it is to do it on paper. Okay, and then when you think you're done, you're really not. As you bring it down, you go around, down, up, and around. It's that action of crossing over. Is there a question? No, oh, you can't see me. Sorry. You could make pretzels if you're baking that day too. Bring it all full circle. Okay, I'm going to move along. They're going to get a little bit harder. Some will be easier. And I wouldn't do, again, because you're only doing one a week. And they're kind of working on it. And maybe, you know, usually I'll start with it at the beginning of the lesson period. And if they're having trouble with their writing, we always go back and work on them some more. But you can intersperse harder ones with some easier ones and just kind of watch your child's progression. So this is another mirroring one. Oh, it's good on the bottom. I wouldn't do that in front of, but I want you guys to see it properly, so I'm gonna have to scoot to this side. So it's really good to know these before you bring them to your child.
I had one person say the pretzel was too hard for them.
The pretzel's hard, and that's like that's a 3rd grade form. The pretzel is really hard, but you can see how, you know, if you're thinking of cursive handwriting, you can see all of the loops that come with cursive really lend themselves much more beautifully when you can flow with a lot of these. And so it really starts to go from being a willing activity to kind of enjoying their writing. And you know, writing's kind of it's a dead art. So really being able to work through this. And you know, we, in this webinar, at least this live part, I can't convey all of Steiner's writing about form drawing. I will be, like I said, putting a good synopsis of it on the blog. And for those of you who ordered the DVD after, it'll come with an insert, because there's so much written about form drawing. Just like anything else with Steiner, there's just a lot of material. So I really wanted to more get you comfortable doing forms and giving you some ideas and building your form drawing notebook. I'm hoping that's what you guys are working on. Now this one is hard too. They're going to get much harder from here on in. So this one is about working with several different planes. So you're working with, oh heavens, let's start it properly. You're working with this, it's still not straight, but. And you know something too, I tend to stand at the table when I'm doing my form drawing. So that might be, if you're uncomfortable sitting and drawing right now, stand up a little bit and kind of, you know, shake yourself off and see if that's easier. If I stand over my work, I can get to it a lot easier. And again, being in front of the chalkboard is a little bit harder. I would, in introducing this to the children, I would absolutely be with my own paper, not necessarily at the chalkboard, unless I drew it on the chalkboard the night before, and you know, then you've got it already there. So, okay, this isn't the whole form. Here we go. And start in whatever quadrant works for you. I always start in this one. Helps them gauge distance and give them an idea on how much space they need to allow. And again, that kind of goes to having the writing being this big and kind of getting it down to manageable size. And you know, if you have a special needs child, these are absolutely wonderful for gauging that that distance. We still have, you know, I can give Harry a piece of lined paper, or even a piece of blank paper, and if I don't give him an idea of how big I want it, he'll make it as big as possible. How are we doing on tape? 5 minutes? Is that why that's flashing? Okay. We'll get through this form and then we'll take a little intermission. Alright, here goes the next part. And I'm assuming those of you who are watching live aren't talking because you're concentrating. It's kind of a hard activity. There. And you can do it in all different colors. You could do the center line a different color than your other lines. And like I said, you can go back over them, do any correcting that you might want to do after. And it really has always encouraged me to, you know, if I've gone too fast over a form, by taking that time to go back and go over it again. It's controlling your will and putting those straight lines and those curves where they should go. Do we have a question?
Oh yeah, with younger grades, do we put form drawings in their main lesson book or create a separate lesson book for forms only? Thanks.
Totally up to you. You know, I've done both. You know, we're not in a school setting. So, you know, there were many years in the very beginning of our Waldorf career where I tried to make everything just like it would be in the school. And, you know, I wanted them to have that Waldorf school experience. And it kind of took some humbling on my part to realize that I'm creating something at home that they're never going to get in a Waldorf school. So, you know, being really, making this your own dance and being really good at just kind of following your own, following your own desires is, I think, a good thing. You could do a separate form drawing main lesson book if you wanted. I really like to have all of their work, in recent years I've found this, to have all of their work sequentially in the same book. And so we may still end up with, you know, 5 books at the end of the year, but I write on the front what, you know, what the dates were when it started and when we ended that book. And then I kind of keep them that way. I like it because I can really start them at the beginning and see a progression of their work through the whole year rather than having to sort through 5 or 6 different books to go, okay, this is where we were at this point, and this is where we were at this point. So it really is very helpful to me. When you're starting to do math on a regular basis in like grade 4, I then get like the very small, the small lesson books that they make, and we don't sell them yet, but we probably should because they're good. They're small. They're like 5 by 7, and we use those for math. And we also just use computer paper for math, and just kind of bind our own book together, because then you're talking more about practice work daily rather than you know, they're definitely when they're in a math main lesson. So if it's a main lesson thing, I keep it in a main lesson book. But if it's practice that we're not, you know, putting a ton of main lesson type effort to, then I would put it on practice paper. How are we doing on time?
We got 1 minute, and I've got a question.
Okay.
Are children supposed to be standing when doing form drawing?
I think whatever they're comfortable with. If their forms aren't, you know, they should be standing when they're doing them in the air, I think, and moving their body, because form is about movement. And so getting them moving, some children will be very comfortable standing and kind of doing a rocking motion while they're drawing, while others will want to be sitting. Keeping them comfortable. You will probably, if you have a phlegmatic child that kind of likes to sit, the more couch potato kind of child, and their forms are not running like they should be, get them up and get them moving, and then get them working on forms.